I'm Gavin Browning, Director of Public Programs and Engagement. Deborah Paredes, unfortunately, could not be with us this evening, so I'm just filling in on her behalf to thank you for joining us for this event on horror, The Shining, and The Changeling. I will begin by reading our land acknowledgement. The School of the Arts recognizes Manhattan as part of the ancestral and traditional homeland of the Lenni Lenape and Wappinger people. We continue to address issues of exclusion, erasure, and systemic discrimination through ongoing education and a commitment to equitable representation. Tonight's conversation is part of our series of public programs organized around the theme of To Transform. In it, we present conversations, screenings, readings, and research about work that enacts transformation on physical, social, political, and psychic landscapes. And you can read more at arts.columbia.edu. I'd like to thank Sarah Cole, Interim Dean of Columbia University School of the Arts and Parr Professor of the Humanities, and Jana Wright, Dean of Academic Administration and Planning, and our co-presenters, which include Book Culture, and books will be for sale after the conversation. Thank you, Book Culture, as well as the Creative Writing Program at Barnard, the Institute for the Study of Sexuality and Gender, the School of the Arts Film and Media Studies Program, and the School of the Arts Writing Program. Tonight, we will hear from Victor Laval, then Dorothea Lasky, and then a conversation between Victor, Dorothea, and Jack Halberstam. And you'll have an opportunity to pose questions and then mingle and buy some books and maybe get them signed too. So just in the interest of time, I'm going to read very abbreviated bios of our wonderful speakers, and you can read their full bios in this program. Victor Laval is an associate professor of writing at Columbia University School of the Arts. His work includes Lone Women, Slapboxing with Jesus, The Ecstatic, Big Machine, The Devil in Silver, The Ballad of Black Tom, Destroyer, and The Changeling, which we'll be hearing about tonight. Dorothea Lasky is an associate professor of writing at Columbia University School of the Arts. Her work includes Rome, Animal, Milk, Thunderbird, Black Life, Awe, Essays, Poetry is Not a Project, How to Excite Young People About Poetry, and The Shining, which we'll be hearing about tonight. Jack Halberstam is the David Feinson Professor of Humanities and Director of the Institute for the Study of Sexuality and Gender at Columbia University. Halberstam's work includes Skin Shows, Gothic Horror and the Technology of Monsters, Female Masculinity, In a Queer Time and Place, The Queer Art of Failure, Gaga Feminism, Sex, Gender, and the End of Normal, Trans, a quick and quirky account of gender variance, and Wild Things, the Disorder of Desire. So, without further ado, I'll hand this over to Victor.
Hello, everybody. I'm so grateful that you're all here tonight. I would normally ask you all to move closer together, but I'm not going to ask that because we live in the world we live in now, and I want everybody to have a little space between each other. So I'm really honored to be here today with Dottie and Jack, and looking forward to the conversation that we'll have. To just give you an idea from my part of things, what we're going to do is I'm going to read a little bit from the novel, The Changeling, and then we're going to watch some clips from the show, and we're kind of going to go back and forth in a way to sort of see, maybe in a way, the what it is as on the page versus what it is on the screen, and the transformations that exist between the two. All right, anyway, so this is going to be a short one just to start, just to give a sense of the sort of energy of the story, both in the book and in the show. This fairy tale begins in 1968 during a garbage strike. In February, New York City's sanitation workers refused to pick up trash for 8 straight days. 100,000 tons of garbage filled the sidewalks, spilled into the streets. Rats ran laps alongside morning joggers. Rubbish fires boiled the air. The 5 boroughs had been given up for dead. Still, there was some cracked magic in the air because that was when Lillian and Brian met. Each had journeyed from far-flung lands to find one another in Queens. Neither could have guessed the wildness that falling in love would unleash. And that, just to give you an idea, that the heart of the story is just fairy tales and cracked magic and love, or love in quotation marks. So if we could watch the first clip, which was just the trailer for the show. It's very kind of you. I'm just going to find the other part now. So that gives, I hope, a general sense of the sort of tone of the show and of the book also. So now I want to read a section from later in the story to broadly summarize what happens. Apollo and Emma fall in love and they have a child together. And then something terrible happens. Emma goes on the run. The baby has disappeared, and Apollo goes searching for her. And eventually finds himself on a real place called North Brother Island in the East River. And there he finds a community of women who have been living there together, hiding out from the sort of the predations of the men that they had families with, men who had tried to destroy their families. So Apollo shows up there and he meets the leader of that community, a woman named Cal. And he's dragged up there by some guards because he was not welcome there. At the top of the stairs, they found another hallway that led off into another series of long unused rooms. This is a schoolhouse that they've taken him to. A bright light shone out of a room halfway down. The woman led him to the room. The women led him to a room. This one had a door. 2 words were stenciled there: principal's office. A woman stood alone inside, her back to Apollo as he entered. She stooped over a long table covered with materials, varied blocks and shapes he couldn't make out. There was another desk, clearly salvaged, stacked high with papers and a very old word processor, a gray block that took up a third of the desktop. The plug for the processor ran down to a red 3,000-watt Honda super quiet generator. 2 standing lamps flanked the table where the woman stood, still with her back to him. 2 of the corners of the room were left in darkness, but compared to the rest of the island, this might as well have been the Eiffel Tower lit up at night. Apollo stepped into the room. Now he was alone with her. She moved 2 steps to the right, picking up something from the table. She had the short, no-fuss haircut of many older women, and her hair was so gray it looked nearly white. She wore slightly loose black leggings with an overlarge gray sweater that draped elegantly down to her thighs. She looked like an Eileen Fisher model. When she turned, the effect became even stranger. She wore a sock puppet on either hand. "Which one's scarier?" she asked. She smiled impishly. She knew exactly the wild effect she had, and this made her seem playful and powerful at once. Here she was, alone with him, and it didn't seem to worry her one iota. He wasn't in any shape to do her harm. He couldn't lift his arms, and he felt his legs only because of the constant throbbing in his thighs. "Hello," she said, raising both hands higher. "They didn't cut out your tongue, did they?" She squinted at him. "No, they would have given it to me." And on that note, we'll watch the next clip where Cal now puts on a puppet show for Apollo right there and begins to cast a little cracked magic. When we filmed that scene, it was just 3 green dots on that doll. And so I only got to see what it actually looked like when they finished the show. So that was very fun for me, and I never saw it on a screen that big. And then, so the last clip I want to show takes us back a little bit, and I just want to tell a more personal story here rather than reading something. One of the things that's central to this story is that the character Emma goes to Brazil for 6 months, and when she returns, she's got this red bracelet around her wrist, and she says it's been there forever, and she really wants to get it off. That this woman in Brazil tied it around there and said, "Make 3 wishes as I tie it on, and you cannot cut it off." And then Apollo, as you saw in the trailer, but we'll see it a little more fuller in this scene, Apollo then says, "I'm going to cut it off." And he cuts it off for her right there because she says, "It's been so long," right? And almost uniformly, without fail, in the show, particularly, people have written me or tweeted to me or whatever and just said, "I want to kick Apollo in the head for cutting that string. I cannot believe he cut that string." And I totally understand it, but at the same time, what I also feel like I always have to share is that In real life, my wife, before she was my wife, moved to Brazil for 6 months. She came back. Her plane was delayed. I waited for her for hours. She got off the plane. We went to a Dunkin' Donuts at JFK, and she said, this bracelet has been on my wrist for so long. I wish it would fall off. And then I cut it off, and I said to her the words that Apollo says with me, and her name's Emily. In the show, her name's Emma. And I said, with me, all three of your wishes will come true. The thing that doesn't get communicated in the show yet, and even in the book a little bit, is what my wife always tells me she wants me to communicate to people happened the moment right after. I cut that off, and then my wife had a moment where she said to herself, I have a choice to make. I either see this, there's two ways I'm seeing this in this immediate instance. I either see this as the bold choice of a man making a promise to me that I could believe in, or I could smack this dude in the face and go home alone, right? And she really, really weighed her options. And she told me clearly, I really didn't know which one to choose. And I decided in the end to pick you and decide that it was the right thing to do. And I am forever grateful that she did. So if we could run that last clip where we see me doing this bold or asshole-ish thing, or someone much better looking than me doing this bold or asshole-ish thing. Thank you all very much. I really appreciate your time.
Oh, it's okay. Oh, I'm okay. Yeah. Hey, everyone. Well, I'm more than a little sad that we can't just sit here and watch your show with this beautiful screen that was so magnificent and have you read. But here I am, and it's such a joy to be here and read with you, Victor, and to talk with you, Jack. And thank you to Gavin and everyone that here that works with Gavin to make this beautiful event. It's so exciting. And so I thought I would read some poems from my new book called The Shining. And we're not going to have shining clips, so you just have to imagine in your mind that they're happening. But this book is such a friend to me. I wrote this book, when we were kind of in the throes of lockdown, and I really, because everything seems so, horrible, I really just thought writing poetry, what's the point of it? It can't really solve anything. So I was, doing my best to kind of keep poetry away and pushing it away as much as I could. At some point, poetry came back to me in the form of The Shining, which is a kind of lifelong obsession I have with this idea of The Shining, and especially the film. The book is great too, but yeah, especially the film has been, something in my imagination that's been so important to me. So, these poems are kind of an homage to my friendship, with The Shining. And so, yes, I'm just gonna read some of them. And because the book is kind of ekphrastic in nature, I think a lot about ekphrasis, and sorry if I am saying that wrong. I've been told before, but this is a friendly audience, so I'm sure it's okay, I hope. But one thing that I think about ekphrasis is that there's empathy involved, because when you're writing, across like other art forms and you're writing poems, to something like a piece of visual art, you kind of have to empathize with something, within that. So, with empathy is often the form of the self-portrait. So I started the book with a self-portrait. So I thought I would share it with all of you. And it's called Self-Portrait in the Hotel. I am here by myself, and I have finished everything. There are no pretensions, no way around the door. I have eaten all the cans of beans and lemons and am face drunk on the floor. There are no cats here, only children, crawling around above me. Yes, they look at me. They absolutely do not know me. They want to look at me and tell me they know. They are fed and ready for the ceremony. I haven't prepared anything. I am so wholly unprepared for this. I was told I'd have a lifetime. Now the whole thing is coming at me. I can't even see myself in the mirror or in the space between the mirror and the wall. He brings me to the gray fixtures and mentions that we are dead. Who didn't know that when I checked into this God-forsaken hellhole? They locked me in the tiny yellow room with no belongings but my lipstick and said I'd be okay as long as I didn't make a movement. In and out he entered me, letting me know what I could or could not say. I wasn't saying anything. I never wanted to say a thing. I only wanted to see myself as vast and unknowable in some horrific ocean. Instead, they drove me for hours, and up on the lands I wandered, red boots and a dark brown coat. I collected aqua pencils, 4 of them. They said it's your job now to tell this story, but I was no storyteller. I was an action figure that had no set box. I was tied up inside the cardboard. A person took me down and drooled all over me. I was not a seer at all, and they knew it. I was only her and will be forever. And when you see her empty eyes, that's me, except my eyes are gleaming. And when there are tears, I will cry them, only for the days that have left me. They drove me here and locked me in a tiny yellow room. They said to be quiet, but I am not able to be quiet any longer. And I like to think of this book as kind of a love poem to Wendy Torrance. I hope everybody's maybe has some familiarity with The Shining. That might be confusing, but you could just watch it later, or read it later. But also in writing the book, there, some of the characters I had like empathy with, and one of those characters is Danny. I think because Danny and I kind of would be the same age, and so a lot of the toys and things he had like feel very emotionally connected to my own childhood. And there is, if you all remember, the scene where he has his stuffed lion. I think I had a stuffed lion that kind of looked like that, but I think that's what makes some of the Shining things extra scary to me, is I can imagine myself in there. But and this poem is called A Lion. In the bedroom after fainting, the therapist comes in. In the bed, a stuffed lion who sits behind the boy in utter repose. I think that I have found the way back in, although I am not quite there yet. You could have picked anyone. I chose to see the inner life. It was orange, cream, and beating. Also, something I was thinking about in writing the book is just this idea of time, and how in horror, time has this great ability to flatten. And just like Victor was talking about, in the show, in the book, and this idea of like the portal. And so time becomes this really interesting portal in horror that I love. So here's a poem called Old Photo that's maybe playing with that. It says 1921 in the picture, and I am smiling, but it's not me anymore, or maybe it never was. He gets so angry when he is drunk and throws the baby across the room. I get so angry when I am ready. I throw myself into oblivion. It says 1999 in the picture. I am wearing a purple dress. There are great planets circling and ahead of me. I never asked for this to be my name. He put a set of pictures up on the wooden wall. He said, find yourself, but that part was easy. And this next poem is called Food Court. And again, just because a lot of the book is like this love poem to Wendy. She's this person, in the shiningness that has to can be in charge of the food. It seems like she's always sort of dealing with the food, and Jack's job is to watch the hotel and write this great novel, and her job, is to cook everything. And so I wrote this poem also for her. Food Court. It's a perfect temperature in here, and everything is clean except the souls. When you open the cabinets, there's every can imaginable, rows and rows of tomatoes. They asked me to make them bread and eggs, but all that I can see are cans and yellow trays. Everyone starts singing, including the hungry. My soul is as clean as the refrigerated walls, and I tell them all so. Suddenly eggs appear. I crack each one into a yellow tray. You know I love a tortured love story, but this isn't what I planned for. In the middle of the accident, I crack another egg on the head of a disbeliever. Everything is perfectly adequate. I stir my lukewarm cereal. My soul is as clean as the spring. I tell no one that because no one ever listened. I crack an egg into the air. It drops like an accident because no one ever loved it. I say to no one at all. You know I love a tortured story. I think to write it down. Instead, I crack this egg here for you. So don't be sorry. Just take the lukewarm pudding and think of me. I'm all alone here, maybe for forever. I crack this lukewarm story into your bowl and you sop it up. I know you love a love story. You sop up my blood pudding with my head. That ending is for Gavin, who I don't know. Not for Gavin. I mean, I didn't write it thinking of Gavin. That was confusing. Gavin knows what I'm doing. Okay, all right. I read it. We'll just talk about that later. Okay. Yeah, so another, important character, I think there's like themes when you have a book called The Shining. You got to hit some themes and you got to have the twins. And so, the twins are in this book. So I wrote them some poems. And I think, just thinking about the twins and thinking about their presence of this, like the double female in like Hollywood and how duets and just this idea of, twins together and of course all the horror implications of twins, of which there's many, but this is a poem for them and it's called Blue Christmas. I am so excited. I am dancing with my sister in the front of the restaurant. Two men look at us and sniffle. We are wearing the clearest blue dresses that look like the sky in the middle of the spring. There is a pretend antagonism to our song, but we know that we really love each other. Years later, they will film us as children, wearing matching dresses again, but the blue will be muted. Soon after, they will show us chopped up. As always, they will be obsessed with the violence men can do to us. But I was only ever trying to do my job. I only ever wanted to be a movie star. True story, but I didn't think that worked out very well. And then, I'll just read a couple more poems. Another, theme you got to hit when you have a book called The Shining, you got to have a little red rum in there. So, some of the poems are a little dark, which I guess is to be expected. So I tried to have like a fun one in there. And this may or may not be a true story, but probably isn't. So this poem is called Red Rum. Lipstick is one of the very finest elixirs. It has a soft consistency and can write on glass. Red rum is sweet and candied with cherries from the bottom of the bottle. We sip it so gracefully. I am in love again. His name is something, but who can remember? Memory is a lake and all of that. I can't remember where I left my last exercise. I was only ever sitting here watching the neon burn out. I have taken my red lipstick and written help across my chest. He looks at it so kindly. I know I am real again. I can feel the sweet bitters of the drink make me into a woman. I am not crying. I am writing sonnets in my mind about all of the vacations we will take after this one. I throw the glass against the wall. The only thing that matters in love is passion. That part's a true story. So I'm just going to end with, I have lots of maze poems in here, so if you like mazes, you might like it, but I love. I just love the idea of the maze, you know, in kind of Shining themes and in horror themes and in mythology and fairy tale, and just this idea of like never really being able to escape a maze once you enter it, or it just being this test of your will, or just all the ways that we get trapped in mazes and logic and that sort of thing. So this poem is called The Green Maze. All the artists of the world are my brothers and sisters, even as I am locked in this house of the high ceilings and slanted bookcases with all of the charlatans and naysayers, the soupy packagers and droopy preachers, pushing me down a ditch or through the open window to an indefinable snow hill. Well, I will surely not survive it. I still call on my family to know what's real or not, and whatever they say to you, chasing you down a hallway that will be forever estranged. Be who you are. It is your job to carry it on, no matter what bull is chasing you for 100 years with an axe in the green landscape of your dreams. Live your dreams and push through until it is daybreak and you see the sun begging you to find the new space to go on. After all, it was and always will be your job to go free. So protect the things that are worth preserving. That's partially you too. Protect those upturned faces into the sun. No matter what, they must carry on. Thank you so much. Thank you. Excited. And should we, oh, okay. And now we're gonna have a little conversation. So, okay. Where do you want to sit? What do you want?
All right. Good evening, everybody. I'm Jack Halberstam, and thank you. I'm so excited to be in conversation tonight with these amazing artists, novelist and poet, who have, in their own way, really, rewritten the horror genre, is how I would put it. And so we're really in for a treat tonight. There are a lot of themes that we can go back and forth between the two works about. I was even, just as I was listening, I was thinking about the puppet show, Victor, in your book with Tony in The Shining, and these sort of prosthetic characters that horror loves so much, and so I definitely would like to talk about that. But let me say something about each book, and then what I want to ask each of you to sort of begin with is to say something about the horror genre and what it allows. Especially in a world like the one we're living in, where horror is a sort of a daily confrontation with world. There might be an argument to be made for horror being sort of redundant as a genre, but there are many, many theories about why the horror genre is an excellent vehicle for example, social protest, and we see some of this in your novel, for pulling out themes that are not necessarily intentional in a film like The Shining, but that nonetheless are there humming in the background, the misogyny, the fear that lurks in the family. And in Victor's book, the positioning of the black family in an anti-black world, which is itself a sort of mise en scène for horror. So given that, it would, and for those of you who haven't been able to read each of these books, Victor's is an amazing book that is a sort of palimpsest of references to fairy tales and to fantasy, but is telling the story of a black family striving to get by in New York City, and under the spell and the pressure of the loss of a child. And there are all kinds of hauntings in that novel, the haunting of the afterlife of slavery, for example, the loss of kinship, but also just, as I said, the daily horrors faced by a black man in Queens, for example, who immediately comes upon the police. And, the achievement of family. And then, Dorothea, in reading your book, it's true. It's such a great COVID text, right? I mean, if you watch The Shining now, you're just like, how was this made before COVID, right? It's such a narrative about the way in which people come psychologically undone in isolation, even with space and with natural beauty. The violence of the family surfaces, and there was much discussion during COVID about abolishing the family, that we all had to come face to face with the potential horror of this particular arrangement of intimacy. So given all of this, let me ask you then to just sort of begin by meditating on the horror genre. And I'm going to start with you, Dorothea. You describe yourself as a super fan of horror, and in LitHub, you, in a beautiful piece, you record watching Carrie as a young person, and feeling a kind of kinship with this young woman drenched in blood by her peers. There's another source of violence, high school, other kids, right? And mercilessly bullied. So I guess I'd like to just hear from you. What makes you a super fan of horror? What drew you to The Shining? And I know that it was some of the excised scenes from The Shining that particularly caught your attention.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And yeah, it's just so exciting to be here. Sorry, I can say it. Because I think horror for me has always been this obsession that's fueled a lot of my poetry and other art, but I didn't exactly know how to place it and articulate it, and I don't know that I totally still do. But I think that lately I've been thinking a lot about, and I know people have said this in a better way, but just horror as a potential kind of healing space or stage, to let kind of the horrors of the world, of which there are many and can never really be fully represented in any piece of art in their absolute, horribleness, to let that be kind of a stage to cathect it and empathize and sort of, and be there almost in a kind of safe arena, because on some level it is entertainment, it is escape, and we hope, although it could be a portal or something, we hope that it's kind of confined to whatever that media is, if it's a movie or a book or something like that. And so I think that's why the genre has always been such a never-ending friend to me, is that it is almost like that safe healing friend that just acknowledges the evil of the world instead of constantly pushing it away, which is something I think that humans are really good at doing. And sublimating it,
or even diving right into it. And Victor, your book is very meta. There's meditations on fairy tales. At one point you say a bad fairy tale has some simple goddamn moral. A great fairy tale tells the truth. And there's also a sense that fairy tales are really for the adult reading the book, not for the child receiving this incredibly horrific tale of torture and confinement, whatever it may be. And there's a lot of other meta material in the book. Emma is a librarian, and Apollo is a rare book dealer. So it's a book about books in many ways. But it's also a treatise on the horror genre and its place in relationship to the representation of racism. So, and of course, horror can itself be a very racist genre. Yeah, so what's your fascination with horror and gothic fantasy and fairy tales?
Well, first I would echo Dottie in that, the truth-telling nature of things, right, is very powerful, I think. But the other thing that I think horror does that almost no other genre can pull off is that monsters can be so malleable, right? Whether you're talking about Jason or Freddy, or you're talking about cosmic horrors, or you're talking about a baby who is evil with no explanation as to why, a bad seed kind of kid. one of the things I love about horror is when you talk to people about what was this story about, what was that movie about, that book, that whatever, and so people can read so many different things into any good monster, right? And a bad monster only has one meaning, I would say, right? You say, for sure, this is what the monster means, and almost without fail, in my feeling is almost without fail, if that's the case, it's not actually horror. It's something else. It's literary realism. It's a thriller. It's a something, they use the trope of a horrible thing, but they put it in a place where there's an explanation, and that's it. Whereas horror kind of says, like, it can be whatever you bring to it, and the greatest monsters shift and shape, and that, since we're almost on Halloween, right? Everybody's always watching Halloween around Halloween, but I always enjoyed that, like, the original idea for Michael Myers, as many of you may know, is like his name was actually just the shape, right? He wasn't Michael Myers yet, but more importantly, Carpenter came across the idea because I guess he said he toured a juvenile institution and he saw a kid just sitting in a corner, and he said, and the kid's expression was so deeply mysterious that it terrified him. He looked at this kid and he said, this is a kid, a human being I cannot understand in any way based on whatever he saw on that face, right? And that was why Michael had to wear a mask, and that's why you never saw his face, because it was this unfathomable thing in humans, right? And that's why I love that it can be, for some people, he's in the later remakes, he's just an abused kid from a working class background. In another one, I forget what he was in the most recent ones. I feel like it wasn't very well explained. But he's whatever he was. He was a cash grab is what he was, right? But then in the original one, he was this mysterious force, right? And I love that in every single one of those cases, you get to read what you want onto it. And I think horror does that in a way that pretty much no other genre pulls off, because almost every other genre thinks you have to explain things, and horror says things are unexplainable.
And I was just thinking how brilliant, Gavin was to call tonight to transform, because just think about what you're saying, Victor, that act of transformation is so important to horror, and thinking about in your, beautiful book, just how, like, the monster is transformed, like what you think, or what you think is there. And I know that Emma says that in the clip we saw, you think you see, or, oh, sorry, I'm going to do it wrong. But you don't see, or, basically what you see is not real. And just this idea of, like, transformation and illusion being so important, and the possibility, like, that something can just change and change and change, and you never fully, it's like this ineffable thing, you can never fully grasp the true essence of it, because it's always shape-shifting. And I think that's what's, kind of beautiful in just writing in general, and then how it connects to horror is that transformation process.
Yeah, that's so lovely, because it's a reminder that horror isn't simply a sort of non-realist or anti-realist genre. It's actually saying reality is jam-packed with this other material, not all of which we can know or grasp. And I loved in the clip that we saw in the book a couple of times, we're introduced to this concept of glamour. I think you say it's from a Scottish kind of folktale where glamour, even though glamour has become something associated, a sort of aura associated with the famous or the fabulous, in its actual original use, glamour meant something that changes. Is that right?
It hides something that hides its true nature, right? And that it can be a force for good, a force for evil. It's just a trick. And glamour is, just taking a shower and putting on a good shirt or something like that is glamour. And then you go out on your first date. That's not you, right? That's the best version of you will ever be. And it's all downhill from there. But that first date, you better make it work, So that's glamour, I think.
And lipstick.
And lipstick, yes, I was thinking that. And just style in general, you know, and not necessarily the way we think of like Glamour magazine. You know, of course, that's like that element of style. But I just think back to writing or really, you know, any art form, the act of style and like the crafting of the aesthetic is a kind of glamour. Because it's not that it's tricking someone, but it is a little bit, it's dazzling them with its beauty so that you can get whatever message, you know, across and makes it more palatable and shining or what, you know, like more sparkly.
Yeah. Of course, there are monsters in The Changeling, and they are sort of consistently strange white men who gather in sort of secret groups and have Scandinavian origins and are committed to the business of stealing children, often immigrant children. I wanted to ask, you know, you almost are looking at a pedophile ring or something, right? And so there's an implication in both of these texts of a kind of pedophilia that in The Shining is sort of already embedded in the white family, and in The Changeling, it's almost as if the act of stealing a child, we call it something else. Mm-hmm. You know, and you have that crazy scene where there are all these men online and they're watching babies sleep in various rooms. So I wanted to ask you about this, you know, this particular valence of the monster.
Well, so it's two things. First, I think just my wife and I have two kids, and I think once we had the two kids, I'm from a family, my mother, my grandmother, we really don't trust people.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
That's
really
clear,
have
yeah.
no faith in others, and we think everyone is a threat, right? Like, that was the family kind of motto, right? Don't trust people. And I think I felt a little bit like kind of hemmed in by that. But then when we had our kids, I think I had a different understanding of my mom and my grandmother's reason for feeling that way, right? Which was just that I love this thing so much that if anything harms it, I will be destroyed and I will want to destroy, right? And so I wanted to channel that kind of fear, which is like the fear I never want to talk about. I wanted to put it in the book to talk about it, right? And to sort of, to see if other people might feel similarly, right? About that. And to, in a way, to sort of think back even to myself and my sister and the ways we were vulnerable and maybe weren't protected, even though the family ethos was trust no one, watch out for everything. That, like, you can't, on some level, you can't actually guard against the world, right? The world is always trying to get in, and some people in the world really do mean to do harm, and specifically to do harm to vulnerable people, right? And so I wanted to talk about that in my own childhood, and then to talk about that in the kids, in our kids. And then very specifically, I picked a Norwegian sort of bloodline that it has something to do with like European immigration to the U.S. and all this kind of things. But it was partly because it was in a weird sort of way, a roundabout sort of way. My wife and I, before we were married, we lived in Amsterdam for 5 months in 2010. Right, I got a fellowship when we were living there, and I don't know. I mean, I don't want to cast any aspersions on the Dutch, but they're very, very, very happy with themselves, I would say, generally speaking, and with good reason. It's a wonderful country. Amsterdam's an amazing city if you can visit, all that kind of stuff, right? But one of the things that occurred to me while we were there was like, thinking about in the US, I was like, well, the British get shit, the French get shit, the Germans, the Spanish, but the Dutch East Indian, they started this whole thing. How come they don't get anything? But I couldn't find any Dutch troll things. So I was just like, we'll just go with Norway. And we'll just get them, because how about them too? And it was just my feeling like we're just gonna go with some Europeans that it seemed like I pulled them out of a bag. But to broadly speaking, talk about that as a sort of the line of like who comes, and more importantly, like who comes and what do they bring with them, and who does that thing harm as they try to gain power and make a place for themselves in this quote unquote new world.
I kind of loved it, actually. The Norwegian. It probably should be a Swedish troll. I think the Swedes are like obsessed with trolls. Yes. I was at an event where somebody was giving a paper on trolls, and the whole time I thought that it was about online trolls. And then she had this little doll. I was like, oh, it's really a troll. Wow, this paper just went downhill. But I love the indictment of not just U.S. racism as it's inscribed into a black-white binary, but European racism as it lives on in the mythologies that are seen as beloved. You know, there's the Little Mermaid in the center of Denmark, in Copenhagen, and the Brothers Grimm, these incredibly bloodthirsty tales. I think that sort of nailing this Scandinavian lineage was brave a little bit, because this is seen, people hold up Scandinavia as this sort of social democracy, when in fact with the various waves of immigrants in the last 2 decades, Sweden has become a really racist country. Yes. So. But the trolls are also online trolls a little bit, right?
For sure. Well, I felt like I had a book when I was like, there's going to be a real troll, and online trolls work for the real troll. And I was really like, that's it. I got a book. I'm done.
Yeah, it's true. And of course, in The Shining, you have your monster ready-made, and we all, whether you've even seen the film recently, you can still hear Jack Nicholson, here comes Johnny, or the axe through the door, the monstrosity that is embedded in the figure who's supposed to be the hero of the story, but that The Shining transforms into the sort of violent heart of the family. And I want to ask you about that, because a lot of horror actually does expose the fact that the family that we idealize and that we promote and that we protect can, in fact, for women in particular, be the site of monstrous violence. And the fact that you turn the camera so that we're seeing this entire narrative through Wendy exposes exactly that narrative. So I wanted to ask you about that decision to sort of, focus on family, really domestic violence. That's what the film is.
Yeah, and I mean, it's hard because I've always really loved Jack's character, even though he's totally despicable. I love the bravado of it. I mean, I just think it's just so amazing how confident he is and not, and just like what he's willing to do, and just, the kind of arrogance, there's a haunted room, I'm just going to go talk to the ghost, like just that ridiculousness of it. But I think, I really love Jordan Peele, and I was watching this interview, and by watching an interview, I mean, I watched a 10-second clip on Instagram, so don't think like great scholar here, but he just said like, what's his favorite character in like a horror movie or something, and he said, Wendy Torrance, because like the way she describes, fear is just so magnificent. And really, he was saying Shelley Duvall is such this great actress. And so, there's a lot of kind of, I don't know, I don't want to say it's been proven, but there's a lot of kind of documentary and interview footage that suggests that Shelley Duvall was mistreated in the making of the film, and that the Jack Nicholson as the actor as well took up so much space, and that she was almost abused. I mean, I don't want to say it can be controversial, so I don't want to make anyone mad, but I would say from my watching these things, it seemed like she was abused and mistreated and almost like emotionally tortured to get that fear out of her. And so I think that just seemed so important to think about in horror, because I think so much of horror, kind of rests on the idea of sadism, and that the viewer, oscillates between like wanting to see this violence enacted, and there's almost like the pleasure of that, the sadistic pleasure, but also the empathy with the victim, and that there's like that kind of like back and forth as like the viewer of horror. And so I think for this book, I really just wanted to think about giving the voice of her fear, and the the beauty of that, or just like the magnitude of that fear, to be in that reaction space to his bravado, and give like that opposite kind of bravado.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's far-fetched. I mean, we know that Hitchcock did the same thing to his leading ladies in order to extract a certain kind of performance that would be compelling, as actually fear-filled. And you do get that from Shelley Duvall. But one of the beautiful conceits that's embedded in that film is that Jack is the caretaker. And not only that, he is the reincarnation of the earlier caretaker. So this notion of the caretaker gone mad, is really the conceit of the film. And the one thing we can really give the film, though, is that Jack gets his due in the end. I mean, I'll also never forget that beautiful scene of his head, his frozen head in the maze, is so satisfying at the end. But this notion that caretaking can be a site of intense intimacy and empathy, to use your word, but can also be a site of torture and violence. I mean, that's in your book too, Victor. The question of, Apollo, I am the god Apollo, I am the good father. Before he's even gotten to the second date, he's telling his potential wife that he wants to be a dad. He wants to take care of the child. And yet for her, she has to get this not a child away from him. So there's a lot of meditation in both of these works on fatherhood, and fatherhood as a site for potential power and potential kindness and tenderness, but also fatherhood that can turn on a dime and become the site of extreme violence.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, certainly in my case, when I was working on the book, there was a version of the book where, Apollo, he wants to be a great dad and he also wants to be a great husband, and then he is, right? And isn't he a wonderful guy? And I certainly would have preferred to write that version, because it would have been very flattering to me, if people assume it's me, right? But even as I was working through drafts, my wife is a writer as well, so we talk about the work a lot as we're going through it. And we would talk about, what are the things that what are the ways that the thing we came upon was so nobody thinks that they're being monstrous ever, right? Even the most monstrous people never think that, right? But the ways that you can sort of figure out how to act monstrously but excuse yourself, right? And so she and I, my wife and I, would talk a lot about the ways that both of us could focus so much on the child that it's a way to make your spouse invisible, right? A way to keep them at a distance, a way to, because on some level, you're all very tired, you're stuck with each other all the time, you gotta be sick of somebody, and you can't be sick of the baby, right? You're not allowed to say that, right? And you, at that stage, maybe you don't even feel that exactly. But you can say, I'm sick of this person. Why don't you shut up? Why don't you get out of here? Oh, you should go for a walk. I'm gonna go for a walk, whatever it might be. But then that takes on a different implication when it's the father versus the mother, because there are all these ways that he is, the story I sometimes would talk about is when our first son was born, we were in Washington Heights at the time, so I'd be walking on 181st. I had the baby in the baby Bjorn like this, and honestly, I'd walk past the pizza shop and the liquor store and people would come out of the store like, what a beautiful baby! You're such a good dad. Look at you! You're amazing! And I'd be like, I am amazing. You're totally right. I am a god. Yeah, but and then my wife go out with the same exact thing the next day, me walking next to her, and someone would come out and just believe, you should put a hat on that baby. That's all she would get, And there was a way that started to become an imbalance for us as well, because am I starting to believe my shit? I'm a great dad. What do you mean I'm ignoring you? What do you mean I'm not listening? I'm a great dad. That's my job. You know what I mean? And so I felt like for the book, I would just extrapolate that out to the worst case scenario, which is that it starts to become a literal divide, because she's saying the baby is not human. He's saying, don't talk bad about my baby. And you can't really get past, I don't care who it is. If somebody says my baby isn't human, that's my enemy now, because that baby's amazing. And then
He says you're the problem.
he says you're the problem to her. And then on her side, she would say, if you can't see that this is not our baby, what kind of human being are you? What kind of man are you? What kind of father are you? Right? And so I really wanted to dig into that divide and talk about the ways that, like, doing the thing that is meant to be the greatest expression of love can also become a great wedge between two people who love each other. And then in this case, rather than going to couples counseling and trying to work it out, something dies, and then fairy tale super journey, right?
Yeah, and that's, this is horror at its best, is sort of unpacking the dangers that lurk in the everyday, in the quotidian all around us, in our intimate relations, in these structures that we depend upon and that we've invested in. But given this kind of opposition that Victor just described between the mom and the dad, that the baby sort of stages, the baby kind of drives a wedge in many ways between the mom and the dad. I want to take that wedge and follow it to the witches on North Brother Island. So for those of you who haven't gotten that far in the novel, Apollo, searching for Emma, is led by one of these white guys who's in his cave, is led to a little island in the East River close to Rikers Island, where he discovers something like a matriarchy or a coven of witches. And I want to ask you, about that whole part of the book. I was confused a little bit in that section. I'm like, are we supposed to see the women on Brother Island as people who are taking refuge from patriarchy? Are they themselves part of the monstrosity in the novel? They're very violent, where there's this is not like The Good Witch. These are baseball bat wielding witches. And there's some ambiguity, let's say, in the novel about the status of the witches in relationship to this drama that's playing out, the family drama.
Well, really, the only thing for me was I certainly didn't want to create some something that said like, well, this kind of like stereotypical heteronormative marriage, that's where the bad side is. But then if you just went to the place where all the women are, there would never be problems. And I just felt like that's not true, right? And so it can't be that the island of women is just happiness and rainbows. The island of women also has like strength and camaraderie and sisterhood, and it also has betrayal, frustration, violence, all the rest. And so there was my feeling was for Apollo to travel to that place as a part of his journey to sort of understand how deep the fairy tale they were in was, but I was not interested in something as simple as, if you just let women run the world, everything would work out fine, because I just don't believe that anymore than letting just dudes run the world, right? Yeah. And so it felt like, okay, we're going to get there and we're going to discover there's magic in the world, but one of the things that still exists is they're still just human beings, and they still do make lots of mistakes. And Cal, from one person's perspective, is a villain who convinces women to kill their children, and that's not entirely wrong. And then in another perspective, she's a woman who takes in women whose children have gone missing and who have been destroyed by that loss. And I wanted to feel like it's both.
You know, and I really appreciate that. And there would have been absolutely no purpose to making it into some sort of utopia, for sure. But I remember there was a similar moment for anyone who got to like season, I don't know, 79 of The Walking Dead. There was one of these moments where I was like, geez, there's a matriarchy in The Walking Dead. There suddenly was, and even in Game of Thrones, there's suddenly, you know, a child queen, and she's ruling with all of the participation of other female sovereign powers. And, you know, so it was in all of these other places too, in all of these other texts too, the matriarchy is absolutely no guarantee of a nonviolent utopian space. But yeah, I almost expected to see some Amazonian, you know, activity, a few lesbians or something happening there.
Well,
We just don't see that part.
that's right. Well, I meant to imply that there were, there weren't any dudes there.
Yeah.
And I thought it would be implied like there's got to be relationships. People got to fall in love. People got to be together, you know. But it's true. I will admit I didn't make it explicit.
Yeah. Just sort of note to self:
fair
women
point.
only spaces. Let's have a little
Gotcha.
activity there too.
I got you.
Well, that's what I think is so magnificent about Emma as a character, is she kind of, you know, that she also like assumes this like power. I mean, there's a power on the island. Like Cal has power. She's going to manipulate you with this magical doll, or she's going to get all these women to do what she says. And like Emma, through this, like, I don't want to I'm the queen of spoiler alerts, but through this unspeakable act, you know, in some way gains her power, gains her glamour. And so like there's like the complication there, because she stops being the good mother, you know, then she's like the worst mother. You know, she does the worst. Okay, I'm giving it away, but I'm trying not to. She does a really bad motherly thing, you know. I mean, yeah. And so like that, yeah, just that complicatedness is what makes her just such an exciting, you know, horror character. And thinking back to you referencing Carrie, you know, that's what makes Carrie so wonderful, and you want to kind of side with her. And I think that's what's so great in this story, is that even though Emma does this, this is how I felt, even though she does something bad, I never really hated her. There was some part where I, you know, again, empathized with her, even though she did something I would hope I would never do. You know, I would never do. I'll just admit that right here. Yeah.
Please. Yes. Can I ask around that, to come back around? Do you feel like I feel like the perspective on Shelley Duvall and her experiences in The Shining, I certainly didn't know about them in the early years when I was watching The Shining, and maybe it came out probably still early 2000s, late 90s, I don't know, whenever it was. But do you feel like, did learning that change? Like before that, had you been in a way compelled by Kubrick's decision about how Wendy was, that like she is just to be brutalized, she is just being weak, whatever it might be that he was kind of projecting across? And then did it change, or did you always feel that sort of empathy for Wendy?
Yeah, I think it really, really grew, because I often think about this idea of like what's hiding in plain sight. And, you know, and this is this idea maybe of glamour or shining or whatever, like what is there. And I feel like Wendy was always this, you know, flower hiding in plain sight, and her but the power of the emotions that she's casting, the mood. In some ways, you could think like she almost cast the mood of the whole story. And, you know, that kind of dread, that anxiety, the shame, the guilt, all of those things that make The Shining so wonderful. Like she does that. So I do think like, you know, kind of really having a space to say, oh, this is why, because, you know, that this emotion in her was real, made me even more like just in love with that character, you know, that there was something more palpable to it that was actually rooted in reality.
At one point, you said in your opening remarks that you felt a kind of empathy with Danny. And I want to move to Danny now and think together about the child. Both of these texts, The Shining, and then your ekphrastic interpretation of The Shining, and The Changeling, center upon a child. And a child that is not necessarily innocent, a child that is channeling all kinds of hopes and fears, and a child that in the Changeling undergoes incredible abuse, whether we believe it's a baby or not. The baby is switched, killed, buried, dug up, swallowed whole, born twice. And it's an amazing amount of stuff that happens to the baby. And again, horror is one of the only places where you'll A, see evil children, and then B, where it's possible, because there are evil children, that you'd also see abuse of children on behalf of some other narrative. So I wanted to ask you to both talk about the child. There are obvious films like Rosemary's Baby that might be touchstones for thinking about these evil, the possibility of evil implanted in the little baby or the child. But also, the refusal of the formulaic construction of the child as a site of innocence and purity. So Danny in The Shining, and as he then appears in your poems, and the Changeling, and also the baby that's switched in Maurice Sendak's Out There Over There, which is the text for your story.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so fascinating thinking about the idea of the evil child and how that does become this theme or this kind of locus for like our fears as a human. We do want, I think, I don't want to say all of us, but there's an instinct in us to imagine people are born with nothing and they're blank slates, and it's our job as parents or teachers or as society to craft them into what they can become. And I think I once saw the educator Carlina Rinaldi speak just about, she's, started the Reggio Emilia schools, and she says, education is not pouring knowledge into the child. And she had a picture of a baby on the screen, so it was very beautiful baby. She says, that she, the baby, is born with everything she needs to know. She is born with wisdom. And so I think that's what horror taps into, that we are born with a wisdom, and there's a way that we make that evil, and that kind of plays into a kind of fun trickster-ness of that fear that every person, sort of understands things that we may not even as adults be capable, of teaching them. They're carrying something over in some respect, whether it's from the other side or they just have that knowledge in them. And so I think that that's what makes Brian, and Danny like such, interest, even though Brian is a baby and we don't really know, what he's thinking, but we can only imagine his fear and his torture and just the wisdom that sadly he's accruing through these experiences. And Danny as that ability to transform, it into this kind of magicalness and like the shiningness and communicate with others and control in some ways his situation. His wisdom, his wit is ultimately what helps him escape. And it's hard to know if maybe that may have been the case with Brian. Brian, did he enact any wit or wisdom even as a small baby to evade, his, more terrible fate? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, like also with, how am I forgetting his friend? Tony, that's right. I mean, that always struck me as one of the great creepy performances, right? Like when he's doing that, but also for the way that it, like depending on which viewing you have, is Tony, like, I think you're supposed to think he's certainly maybe his psychic power on some level speaking to him, his unconscious, his subconscious speaking to him. But there are times when I was watching it when I was a younger kid, I thought like, oh, Tony's evil, right? Like he's like the bad part of him, of Danny, and he's telling him these things to scare him or to, like, it's not an entirely like self-preserving sort of thing. And then as I got older, I said, no, well, if you listen to it, he's saying these things, right? But I love the idea that there was room for this sense that this kid is complicated, right? That there's a lot inside this child. And if anything, I mean, certainly, yeah, Brian is a baby. In a way, the life force that has maybe, to my mind, more personality is the changeling child, right? Just because it is, you are actually seeing, that's what you're actually seeing alive for a good bit of when they're raising it. And then in the scene when they dig up the grave and Apollo finally sees it truly for what it is, it's monstrous, but he has empathy for it, right? Because he understands, like, it didn't ask to be born, it didn't ask for this existence, but he does still leave it in the grave. I mean, you know what I mean? He doesn't take it and raise it or anything like that. So yeah, I was particularly interested in the ways that babies of that age also, you know, they don't have any personality, right? Like they're not actually interesting. They're just alive. And everything about them is what I'm projecting onto. They're so beautiful. That smile was because they recognized their mother. And, you know, who knows, right? They might as well be a pile of sticks, right? But there's something in you that makes you want to keep it alive long enough for that personality to become something you can understand. Even as I understand, I agree totally, like the personality was in there, but whatever they had couldn't be communicated to what we could understand, you know? But I was interested in that sight of this thing that is unknowable, right? But and so, like, why do you love it? And it can't be because of it, because it's nothing. I mean, you know, I love both our kids very much, but it's nothing, you know? It's just a lump. But you're pouring so much into it. And it's almost like, and then you are repaid by that when it can begin to communicate back with you. But in that in-between time, you know what I mean? It's just all faith.
Faith and flesh.
That's right.
I was just thinking it's also like the magic or glamour or shining or whatever of like nurturing, you know, how much, you know, loving something does make, you know, a plant has only so much capacity to survive. If we don't water it, we have to nurture it. And that makes its potential, you know, be something that is like affected by us. And that's kind of, that is a terrifying idea because we can always walk away from nurturing something, and we do, you know, sadly. And how does that change things?
Okay, we are going to open up to questions. I just, you know, I want to end by saying, if there's any time that, Victor, it'd be lovely to hear you think about this opposition that you've given us between the book, because Apollo is a book collector, and all the technology that he's using, including the technology that his friend gives him, daylight and so on. And then for you, Dorothea, just the relationship between the film and the poem. You know, the film is is already an ekphrastic gloss on Stephen King's novel. And because Kubrick was famously so particular about every single shot in the film, it's really a visual poem in some way. So I just want to put those themes out there. But I'm also aware of the fact that we only have 10 minutes, and I bet there are lots of people who have questions. So I want to open up for questions. Christine, and then we'll come to the front or the other way.
Thank you. Jack, I'm glad that you sort of brought up that last idea of the difference between the novel versus technology. My question's for Victor. One of the things that I loved about getting to see the TV adaptation of The Changeling and to see what was a novel form brought into a new form is the way that the new media type allows the story to remain really faithful to your novel, but also to breathe in very different ways, to expand and contract different pieces of the story. I think it's most obvious in this show in that we get to see a lot of Emma's point of view that's not in the novel. We also get to see a lot more of Lillian's story. But the thing that really struck me was the addition of these sort of little tiny new stories that crop up in the show, the underground community and the subway tunnels that Emma goes to, and the man dying of AIDS that Lillian meets. I was wondering, with your role in the adaptation of the show, how much of that comes from you, how much of that comes from the collaborators on the show, and with the parts that do come from you, are these things that you have thought about in the interim since the novel was published? Are these things that sort of came up as new for the show, or these other stories that you wanted to tell? I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about the additions to the adaptation in that way.
Sure. So the the original version of the book had more of Emma's storyline in it. But the problem I faced was that Emma was right. And so you figured that out very quickly. And so then it only made Apollo look like more of a buffoon. And you didn't want to spend time watching him. I didn't want to even spend time watching him figure it out, because the book had already told me where the end point sort of was, you know? And so for me, I thought like, okay, the thing I feel like I know deepest is Apollo's journey, so I'm going to do that. But when we moved to the adaptation, the showrunner / writer of all the episodes, Kelly Marcel, we became very, very tight, and we talked through a lot of what Emma's journey had been. We talked through what Lillian is very much based on my mom and her journey to come to the U.S. and some of the guilt that she carried and some of the things that she sort of experienced when she was younger. And then Kelly was a new mother who was in marriage. They're divorced now, so I mean, it was like moving through that. So she was like, the TV show has room for more Emma in particular, and I want to take the things that you had in mind, but I also want to pour all the things I'm working through as a new mother and as a wife who may not be a wife for much longer, all that kind of stuff. So she was able to pour all that in, and then in a surprising and fun way, Lillian's, like my mom's journey, even though Kelly is a white British woman, her mother and my mother turned out to be very similar people in certain ways. And so she was able to pour a lot of her mother too into the Lillian episode. And so the kind of the joy of it for me was, like a lot of times when there's adaptation, they pay you for the book and then we're going to take this much of it and then we're going to do a million other things with it, right? But Kelly's whole point was I only want to be additive. So I really got a gift in that the book, as we get season 2, everything that's in the book will be a part of it. But then there's all this other stuff that we've talked through that would be added in season 1, all the stuff that Kelly got to add, because there was just space, right? And then in a way also having actors as good as Clark and just everybody, you know what I mean, across the board, meant that you want to spend time with them. You want to see what they're doing. You want to see how they're going through, Jane Krasinski as Cal, I thought brought so much power and energy to just a couple episodes, right? And there was just room to do it. And so it was the two of us sort of pouring that stuff together and her bringing in insights, perspectives, experiences that I certainly didn't have access to, but she did. And the show allowed us to have kind of all of it, and so it was just felt very lucky.
Question here? Thank you all for this. I always think about horror and comedy as like cousins, and I could feel it. I feel it in the book. I feel it between Apollo and Patrice. I feel it in just hearing these poems, and kind of a friendship is like, I feel like you're hearing a bunch of inside jokes between two friends. And I was wondering if in the process of writing these books, did you think about comedy at all, or was it something that was part of the process, or was it part of like the mystery at all, of like something that naturally arose? Because it was there, it was percolating, and do you think of it as something connected to horror too, for both?
You want to go first, or what?
Well, the only thing I would say is there's a poem that Dottie didn't read tonight that is in the book that is hilarious, like unbelievably hilarious, and also messed up, as it should be. But there's just, I was telling her in the green room, like there was just this one particular line in the middle of the poem that I just was crying with laughter. So I just felt like that, like it was the epitome of exactly that. Like it was in the middle of something horrible, and then there's this line that just kind of goes, boom, right? And then Dottie said, "But I'm not going to read it tonight because I'm not sure. I'm not sure if you got to read the room, kind of thing. You got to figure it out." But that's my pitch to buy the book, because it's in the book. So.
And my pitch to buy your book. But I was just thinking about the humor, between Apollo and Patrice is so funny. Just again, that like the the jabs that they have at each other, and it's just like you could just watch them do like a stand-up act and like their interactions. But I think what's so amazing about horror is there's always comedy in it. I feel like that horror always includes these funny, moments, not only to like make some levity because something horrible is happening, but also just to remind you that it is entertainment, and that, and I think about this with Freddy Krueger. I love Freddy Krueger, and he is so funny. He's always saying like the most hilarious, and he knows he's funny too. And, that's why it's like sometimes hard for me to find him truly scary, because when he's smiling, it's like you just know he likes the joke more than what he's doing. He's just like a frustrated comedian. So I think they're very tied together.
Don't you? I find even in a strange way, if I watch horror that is entirely humorless, I almost can't buy it. Like when it's just unrelentingly grim start to finish, I kind of go... Because the other part of it is like, horror is so stupid, right? Like if you took the premise of a thing, whatever horror it is that you love, and you just explained it to somebody, they would be like, "Get out of here," right? But something in the way that it's delivered makes it have power to it. But I feel like there's power in acknowledging like, this is scary, 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 and then occasionally, this is dumb. And then you come back, and in a weird way, I think it teaches you as entertainment, and also I appreciate it because I need the thing to say, okay, that was silly, but now look at this, and you turn it back around. So I feel like they're like, you almost can't have one without the other, and it'd be great, Like in The Shining, I mean, that at least to me, I find like some of those conversations he has with the ghosts genuinely funny because they're so gone. But it's two guys egging each other on to act really badly, particularly that conversation in the bathroom, right? Like that one is so grim that it's almost funny. Like when he says, "I had to correct them about his family." About his kids and his wife, I'm just like,
With an axe.
With an axe, yes. It's horrific, but it's also the idea that he's taking it that seriously, that's his perspective on, I corrected them, is bleak humor, but it's on the edge of it.
Yeah, there's also that idea, like in comedy, of like testing people, like comedians like test the audience, like how far can I escalate that? And that's what's like interesting about that conversation too, is like and Patrice and Apollo, it's like that idea of like testing another person, like how deep can I go? How far can I take this?
Other questions?
It's perfect timing.
Yeah. Any final remarks from our speakers?
This was so much fun. Thank
It really
you.
was.
Yeah.
And thank you all.
You.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Obviously, you can get your books signed here, and please come out for the next one. Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.